And so, what was your reaction to our gospel reading this morning? Did you find yourself thinking, it just seems so unlike him, so unlike Jesus? That's the usual reaction to that passage. Yes, Jesus did finally respond to the woman's pleas, and her daughter was healed. But first, there was his terrible silence in the face of her great need, as if he was trying to ignore her. Then there was that statement about being sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, as if to say that he wanted nothing to do with her, because she was not a Jew. And of course, there was that business about not taking the children's food and giving it to the dogs, as if he was calling her a dog. That's what's so disturbing. His ignoring her, his seeming lack of compassion, his harshness, if not outright cruelty. It just seems so unlike Jesus. So what's going on? How are we to take this passage? How are we to interpret it? Well, actually, there are at least three possible interpretations. The first interpretation claims that the statements of Jesus aren't really as harsh as they seem. Jesus was sent first to the Jews, his own people, to call them back to God, because they were God's chosen people. His statement about taking food from the children was really a current proverb, which meant something like charity begins at home. And the word dogs referred to household pets and was not meant to be unkind or cruel. Jesus was simply being honest with a woman who was a Gentile, a non-Jew. Jesus really would have liked to have helped, this interpretation says, but he was sent first to those who believed in the God of Israel and who could respond with faith. And he had so little time and so many to reach. But if the woman could somehow respond with faith, then Jesus would respond to her. And so Jesus decided to test her, to see if she would. He tested her because, in fact, she did worship many gods and probably saw him only as something of a magician. And to respond to her without requiring faith would only confirm her view and lead others to think the same. So hence both his silence and his words were meant to test somebody who was a stranger to God. The woman responded with great faith, and her plea for help was answered. And Jesus was seen as ministering to all who came to him in faith and expectation. The one small problem with this interpretation is that in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, there is no word for dogs as household pets. Dogs were dogs. The second interpretation, though, leaves untouched the harshness of it. Jesus' mission was to the Jews alone, and thus the woman had no claim on him at all. She was an outsider, and Jesus' refusal to help was for real. It was not a test. He had no intention of responding. He took a firm stand against those who wanted only to manipulate him and not truly believe in him. But the woman's bold approach to him, her persistence and her willingness to accept even a crumb, her recognition that only by the mercy of Christ and the grace of God, and not by any claim of her own, could she hope for a response, moved Jesus to see in her a great faith, and he responded to her great need. And so the story is about having no claim on God and seeing that our only prayer is God's grace and mercy. But there's another possible interpretation. Picture for a moment Jesus and his disciples walking along when a woman begins shouting and begging for help. She is a stranger and she is a Canaanite, and some considered her to be ritually unclean. She remains at a distance, and Jesus says nothing. because he wants to see how his disciples will react. And what do the disciples do? They become very uncomfortable and ask Jesus to just send her away. Send her away because she's a woman and a Canaanite and making a scene. Then Jesus says he is sent only to the lost house of Israel. But he says it not to the woman, but to the disciples. He's looking at them, not her, and simply saying out loud what the disciples are thinking. That she is not one of them, and they should have nothing to do with her. When the woman approaches him and begs for help, Jesus answers with that business about the dogs. And he is again looking at the disciples, not at the woman. And again he is voicing the disciples' thoughts, that the Canaanite is a dog, and they should not waste their time on her. In other words, Jesus is testing the disciples and not the woman, testing them to see if they will respond to outsiders and outcasts as he does. In a confrontation with the Pharisees immediately preceding this incident, Jesus declared that true cleanliness had to do with what's inside a person, not with some ritual of washing on the outside. And now he wants to see if his disciples will act on that, if they will look beyond what they see on the outside when they look at that woman and recognize her persistence and her realization that all she has to stand on is God's grace and mercy, to be true faith, and respond to her with compassion and welcome her. So, which interpretation is correct? There's no way to say. There is no independent, outside authority that can declare for certain what is meant. So perhaps we should just let all three interpretations speak to us, because all three speak a truth we need to hear. The first interpretation certainly speaks a truth we need to hear. The truth is that we can't have it both ways. We can't worship all the little gods of society and yet follow Christ too. Like the Canaanite woman, we often do worship many gods, be they the gods of success or wealth or power, the god of the self. And yet we also want Christ to respond to us when we need him. And like some interpreters, we want to lighten or make less harsh his call for faith. But we can't have it both ways. And so perhaps there will be times when Christ does test our faith, is silent to our pleas, because we have become a stranger to him and approach him as if he is a magician for hire. Christ isn't really interested in a one-night stand. He seeks a long-term, committed relationship with us. So Christ isn't being cruel here, just very, very honest. And that leads to an even more difficult truth. The truth that we are all of us the Canaanite woman. We are all of us outsiders. We all of us have no claim whatsoever on God. Deep down, I think we often believe that we do have a special claim on God. That God owes us something because of our goodness or belief. But if we take seriously Christ's call for faith and obedience, if we're honest with ourselves, then we will know that none of us can come before God with a special claim on God. That in so many respects we are unclean, and our only prayer is God's grace and mercy. And the Canaanite woman understood that. And yet she would not take no for an answer. She approached Christ with a boldness and sought his mercy and was willing to accept whatever he would give. She trusted herself to his mercy and grace. And Christ responded to her with compassion because of what he called her great faith. And that is great faith. to approach God knowing that we have no claim on Him, but approaching anyway with a bold trust in God's grace and mercy and a willingness to accept what God offers. A bold trust that God will respond to our deep need. And that leads to the last truth of the story, the truth of what we need to be a believing community. What we need to be as a believing community. Just as Jesus was looking at the disciples when He spoke those words, He is looking at us today as we hear Him speak them again. Looking at us and testing us to see if we understand. Understand that if we are no different than the Canaanite woman, no different from all those who, like the disciples, we just want to send away. All those who disturb us and make us uncomfortable and whom we want nothing to do with because we judge them to be somehow unclean, then to be a faithful community of believers is to show to those very others the same grace and mercy God shows to us. That to have great faith as a community is to follow Christ's call to welcome all who see Him, and to be Him to others. It is a disturbing, difficult story, to be sure. But in the end, it's not unlike Christ at all, I think. For it's very much like Christ to confront us with the truth, to challenge us to trust His grace, and to call us to be Him and live with a faith out of which can come a stunning miracle or two. Amen.